Who owns the bioeconomy? Is it a couple of organizations, a couple of big companies who benefit from the value and the impact that this creates? Or can we create a bioeconomy that is co-owned, co-shared, really owned by nobody, but governed by everybody? That's my big dream.
Iram, what's going on?
Just been busy jamming away, listening to some new music.
You told me about that. Medieval hip hop.
Carl, it is all the rage. It is all the rage. It helps when I'm jamming away on a document. It's like fun here. I think the best thing to do is share just so people can get on the medieval hip hop train. So let's give it a listen. Yeah, love it.
All right, so it's all the rage in your world. I love that.
It's all the rage in my Instagram feed.
When you look at this on Spotify, how many people are actually subscribed or listening to per month? I'm curious.
Yeah, let me see here. It says the musicians Beetle the Bardcore, and they have 150,000 monthly listeners.
That's pretty respectable.
Yeah.
I have some things I follow where it's like 200 listeners per month.
What's that then? What are you listening to?
Weird egg punk stuff. So anyway, what's going on besides medieval hip hop? We just had the Oscars. What do you think?
The Oscars were cool. I mean, I don't really care, to be honest with you, when it comes to famous people getting recognized in the public. Congratulations, you're already recognized because you're famous. But I do love the fact that a lot of people are watching something at the same time. It's the same reason that I love the Super Bowl, because we have a collective consciousness looking at something live. I love that feeling. So Super Bowl parties, I'm down for that, because just everyone's celebrating, obviously food and drink and everything's there. Oscars, we had a mini Oscar party, just myself, my husband, and our 3-year-old. My husband wore a blazer, and so did we put a blazer on my son. We were wearing pajamas on the bottom. I wore a dress with leggings. And yeah, we were just chilling at home. I was making a little bit more like upscale food. I did an Austrian chicken schnitzel, which might not be upscale in Austria, but for us, we feel like it is, because it does take a lot of work.
Pound the chicken,
put it in the flour, then the egg, then the breadcrumbs, and then fry it up. But yeah, I just loved it. I didn't really watch any of the movies. I mean, I did watch a couple of them, actually.
What do you mean? We saw Oppenheimer together.
Oh, yeah. Oppenheimer. Oh, my God. That was great. Yeah, so Cillian Murphy, who I love. I think he's a great actor. I've loved him for a long time, even before Peaky Blinders, which is a show that was really good that he was in. And then Emma Stone for Poor Things, which I thought was a really interesting movie. I think it could have been a little bit more whimsical versus a little bit more hardcore, I guess. Yeah, I know you haven't seen it, but maybe you can put that on your list. There's a few that we need to get to, but I don't think there's any movies about biology. I mean, I'm sure there's always mentioned in some scene in a movie, but I think I need to watch Killers of the Flower Moon, because that features Native Americans. And I know that Native Americans really respect nature and biology. And I just love that.
Yeah, but I don't think that's what that movie's about.
Yeah, I don't think it's about that, but maybe there's some references. Any movies that stood out to you?
Yeah, I watch movies all the time. And I have to say that we saw Oppenheimer, we saw Barbie, but I also haven't seen Killers of the Flower Moon. There's a couple of other ones that were really interesting that I didn't see yet. I haven't seen American Fiction, but I'd like to see that.
I watched that last night.
Oh, did you? What was it on?
Good. It's very good. I just bought it. It's like streaming, so you can just look it up. But yeah, oh my God. You'll love it, Carl, because you are an author. So it's like amazing about how you don't have to write well. You just have to write about something people want to digest. One scene is when he compares the different grades of Johnny Walker, where there's the blue label, the red label, and then the black label. I forget which ones are which, but one's a premium, but one's like the basic cheaper version. And that's one that has the most sales and most people buy because it's cheaper and it's easier to consume. And he compares that to books in saying that there's books that just cheap, it's easy to read, doesn't have a lot of depth, and that's what sells. And it's just so interesting. I'm like, oh my God. I think about us sometimes because when we create content, because we're scientists and we really want to make sure we are very knowledgeable and everything's truthful, and we take a lot of time to write content, But man, people are just writing content willy-nilly and they're getting a lot of recognition. They're doing it fast and easy and obviously clickbait, but it's just interesting to see how that translates into money.
Yeah, there's a lot to unpack there. I think it's hard, especially when you're doing heavy science content. It's not as clickbaity, but I do know that we've always had good luck with content that is about the people we know. That content tends to do really well and seems to spread pretty far. And whereas like some of the more serious content that we do that's about developments and synthetic biology, they don't get as much clicks, but sometimes it's surprising when they do. It'd be interesting to go back and we'll talk about it later in terms of like how we've been curating the content from the podcast.
I think we should just do it, Carl. We should try to figure out how to make truthful, clickbaity bio content. It's like, oh, this protein does the craziest thing you'll ever believe. And it's
right.
And it's like, maybe it does something crazy. I mean, biology is so interesting. And a lot of people don't know, it's not part of the mainstream. And this is the purpose of our podcast, is to get biology more in the mainstream. So how do we make it, gossip filled and clickbaity and just get more people into biology?
Yeah, it's like when I go back and I look at the last, 6 months of content, the things that have gotten the most engagement are either surprisingly about 3D printed meat. I guess that is interesting to people. But then a lot of things where it's people we know, our Brooklyn Mafia Christmas party, when I was down in DC for the Bioeconomy event, that got a lot of clicks. So I agree with you. I think what are the ways that we can make our science more clickbaity? I think that's super interesting. One of the things that you had put on the list of things to discuss was this New York Times feature on AI learning with DNA and RNA. That's super interesting. I didn't see that article.
Well, first of all, it was sent to me by my friend Ed on Sunday. He's like, this is one of the lead articles on the New York Times today, a Sunday feature about AI learning to be alive using DNA and RNA information. And it was pretty fascinating. I kind of skimmed through it and I wanted to talk to you about it, but really it's what separates life from non-life. I mean, we can talk about DNA and RNA, but what is it particularly that makes DNA cause something to be alive? And It's this whole concept of an internet of cells, which a lot of people that we speak to on this podcast start alluding to, and they talk about programming cells and how does that work, but how do they all communicate and what can we learn from it? They compared learning some aspect of biology. It took like 150 years to learn something. And then they basically fed this AI all this information without labeling it about like DNA and RNA. They didn't really give it too much information. And it was able to get that same insight about a cell in 6 weeks. So it took humans 150 years to get that insight about the cell, but it took AI without knowing anything about DNA and RNA. It took it 6 weeks to learn about that same exact cell. I think it was like a cell that's attributed to the kidneys. So it was just really interesting to see how fast AI can gain or share insights, or at least crunch data. I mean, I don't know about sharing insights, but what else are we going to learn in the next year, 2 years? And a lot of times we talk about 5, 10, 30 years. This stuff is going to happen probably in the next 3 months. So let's pay attention.
Yeah, so there's a couple things I'll comment on. One is that's super interesting. I think I mentioned it last time that when we met up with Elliot Hirschberg, who we're about to have on the podcast, he mentioned that the number of genomes that are available for searching is about 270,000. So that's 270,000 total genomes out of something like almost 9 million species of animals on the planet. So we've barely sequenced 3% of all species. And just think of how much engineering we're able to do in biology today compared to what's going to happen when we've got 10% of species or 25% of species available to us to mine and learn from. Things like CRISPR for gene editing, the polymerase chain reaction, those are all biological processes that were discovered by humans. So imagine training AI to look for those kinds of things and the kinds of new tools that we're going to have. So I think this is a humongous rabbit hole that we're going to have to explore over many episodes. The one thing I would also add to it is NVIDIA, who has become like the de facto producer of AI chips, does have an AI drug discovery arm, and they see what they're doing as enabling drug discovery. And we know many companies that are using AI to discover drugs. So I think it's super interesting that NVIDIA sees that as a really important part of their future. And I think the impact of biology on computation is going to be profound.
Yeah, absolutely. And I just love the fact that this was featured as the lead article in the New York Times. It's now becoming mainstream to talk about biology and AI. How are different people going to interpret it? I hope more people start listening to our podcast because we talk about biology and AI often. And we talk with experts in the field that are using AI and biology, and they're applying it in different ways. They're learning different things. So hopefully this is a signal that we're going to have a larger community and people that are more interested in biology and synthetic biology.
Right. I think that's a great way for us to segue slowly into today's podcast. You attended a DeSci event a couple of weeks ago, so that's Decentralized Science. And we've had a couple of podcast episodes about DeSci. But what was the DeSci event and how is it relevant to today's conversation?
Yeah. So that DeSci event I had mentioned in a previous podcast, I've gone to a few of these, and the community is very strong. And the whole idea of decentralized science, that there's research happening in different parts of the world, and the outcomes are being shared across the blockchain and in a way that's secure and available. So it's a great tool to use. And I really wanted to talk about it because of our guest today, Albert Annis of ValleyDAO. We're very excited to talk to him because I've been hearing about DeSci. I've been meeting people that talk about tools to use DeSci. I met Siraj Raval, who put his DNA on the blockchain and protected it with an NFT and sold it. And it was purchased a couple of times. So he's actually making money from, so it's not just his DNA, but his whole genome that he put on the chain. I thought it was very interesting that, look, data is being put on the chain. People can use it for research. And this is exactly what ValleyDAO is doing. I know you've met Albert. When did you meet him?
I think Albert and I know each other from Symbio Beta and had interacted with each other a few times there. We got to talking and we thought, hey, we did this interview with Jocelyn Pearl of LabDAO. And then previously, we had done an offline interview with Ari Lippman, also of LabDAO. You had been going to these DeSci events. And so I thought, let's get Albert on. ValleyDAO is this intersection between synthetic biology and climate. And so it's a good place for us to be exploring because we're interested in climate, we're interested in symbio, and the DAO form or the DAO structure is super interesting. And so I think with that, let's let Albert tell us more about ValleyDAO. Albert Annis, welcome to the Grow Everything podcast. We're super excited to have you here today.
Thanks, guys. I appreciate the chance that you guys given me.
Yeah, so we're very excited to have you on. You have a master's in biotechnology. So what was your inspiration and motivation to pursue these fields of study?
I have a master's in biotechnology, but part of my master's was synthetic biology. But what inspired me to pursue this was really during my studies, I was always looking for something to apply my skills and the knowledge that I received through the different courses. And one day I picked up that some students were in the process of creating this iGEM team. This was at Lund University in Sweden, back where I was studying. So this was the first iGEM team. So I got the chance to put together the team, raise funds, and really go deep in the field of synthetic biology.
I think we're going to hear that from a lot of people because iGEM is a force and it has been the introduction to biotech and synthetic biology for tens of thousands of students. Drew Endy has said we need hundreds of thousands of students or millions of students because such a small portion of the population knows anything about biotech or synthetic biology or even just science in general. Based on that, being part of a iGEM team and getting into synthetic biology, how do you make the leap to starting a DAO?
It's a bit of a story, but after doing iGEM, I actually did iGEM again. So I really caught the iGEM bug, so much so that I ended up working for the iGEM organization itself back in 2020. They were trying to see if they could get more of these iGEM teams into startups. So I got hired as a consultant to help them establish their accelerated program where we put together a curriculum of 10 weeks fully remotely. and really gave these young students a better understanding of the industry and the commercial landscape and how they should think about translating some of their proof of concepts. Essentially, that's what many IGM teams get to. It's a proof of concept. I finished up that. Actually, I was still studying while doing this work, and I got the chance to do my master thesis at KTH in Stockholm. During this time, I was commuting back and forth for a long duration of time every day between the lab and a house that I was living in that was in the middle of the forest. But during this commute, I was always reflecting on my experiences of working in the lab. Like that time, those 20 minutes or 30 minutes are like super, super valuable. And it's not so often we get that time to just reflect. But for me, that reflection was about my experience at the academic lab. I was reflecting about the stresses that I was seeing amongst academics. I was just a master's student, so I wasn't a PhD or a postdoc experiencing the real stress. So I was experiencing it from a third person view. Stress of having to publish, being referenced, raising from grants, and while at the same time, you have to do good science that you hope that will move the needle on biotech research. So I came to the realization that the most important stakeholder in the industry, at least to myself, is also the most pressed stakeholder. So I started thinking like, okay, what can I do? What can we do to alleviate some of these pain points that are ultimately holding back the whole industry? After graduating, I got the chance to start working with a lot of entrepreneurial academics. This was a job at an incubator program in Copenhagen. This incubator program was financed by the Novo Nordisk Foundation. So they had a lot of funds to put into a lot of different academic companies, particularly in the industrial biotech and different life science areas.
It was a Bioinnovation Institute.
Exactly. It was the BII. So I got to work with a lot of academic founders, as we call them. And what I started seeing at my time at the incubator was the most successful founders were the founders that had managed to receive some sort of translational funding for their work that enabled them to really bridge their research out from the lab. The thing is, there is a lot of funding for exploratory research, like blue sky research, where the goal is to make E. coli do some sort of backflip, and then you go straight to publishing. But once you've managed to do a couple of backflips and cool moves, there's really no additional incentives for you to make it do a double backflip, let's say, or doing it in a more efficient way. We call it the translational gap. And our thesis is that there is a lot of research out there in the world that is just sitting on academic shelves, not realizing their full potential. And that's where we believe translational funding can have a real impact. So that was primarily what I saw. They had received some translational funding. And secondly, they had a pre-existing strong network of business mentors, academic collaborators, industry advisors, and people who had a direct vested interest in the success of their research. So these were the two things that I started discovering that enabled the success of a lot of these founders to the extent they could actually raise follow-on funding. They got their first deal with, let's say, a distributor and so on. So I started thinking for myself, like, how could this opportunity be delivered to more researchers on a more global scale? Usually I'm the kind of person, I'll do something, but also start thinking about like, how can I do this even better? What is the next step? Remember that I previously said that I used to live in a house in the middle of the forest. This was a strategic decision by me and a couple of friends because this was back in 2020 that we moved to this house. It was escape from this whole COVID drama. We just wanted to, okay, let's just go out into the woods, peace, silence, time for reflection. But luckily it was close to the location where I was doing my thesis. One activity that we were spending a lot of our time on was researching different blockchain projects and see if there was some projects we could throw some money at. The thing is, when you actually start studying and researching the underlying technology, some of these projects, you realize that this technology has the potential to not only revolutionize the financial system, but also the coordination of people, particularly people with a shared goal working towards a shared mission. The problem with blockchain and crypto today is people have a very surface level understanding of what it is. And it's usually an understanding that is like from some magazine that writes about a big scam or an NFT that was sold for 300 million and these things. It never actually highlights what it can actually do because it doesn't generate clicks. So I started thinking more about how these technologies could be applied in the context of Symbio. Could we use this to fund research? Could a couple of strangers align on a shared set of principles and start working towards a certain cause? So I was playing with that idea. And one of the biggest proof points to me that decentralized and community-driven projects like running on the blockchain could be a potential solution to the funding gap and the translational gap was actually a project. You can also see it as a movement called the ConstitutionDAO. This was back in 2021. It was made public that the 11th authentic copy of the US Constitution was about to go on an auction on Sotheby's. So a group of strangers online got together with this bold and crazy idea to buy the authentic copy, the real thing. And can you guess what the starting price for the auction, where it would fall approximately?
I'd say 10 million.
Yeah, I would say higher, like 40 million.
Somewhere in the middle. It's 20 million. It's a crazy amount of money. This initiative, like the Constitution, it started as a meme. It was a bunch of people online who were like, let's buy the US Constitution. And then that spread like wildfire. You start with 100 people, 1,000 people, 10,000 of people ultimately ended up donating funding for this cause. Why, you might ask? I really don't know, but I think like my interpretation is that they believe that the US Constitution should belong to the people. It shouldn't be locked up in a billionaire's home. And the goal that this group had was to buy it and place it in a museum where the public could go and enjoy and look at it. What this group of people used was a blockchain-based organizational structure called a decentralized autonomous organization, or abbreviated called a DAO. You can see these as a digital community with a shared mission and a shared bank account. Everyone that contributes funds, they also receive a receipt that gives them the digital voting right on how the Constitution was to be used, for example, where it will be placed, and if it were to be re-auctioned, what would be the terms and conditions of that. So all of these tens of thousands of people that contributed funds would have a say in how the Constitution would be managed. They ended up raising 47 million, and they had a third party go there and represent them at the actual auction. They almost won the auction, but they ended up not winning it. The winner of the auction was somebody named Ken Griffin, who is a big hedge fund manager. So it didn't end as the ConstitutionDAO people would have hoped. Everybody got their money back. But I think the biggest realization that people had is that crypto and blockchain technology can be a tool to get a lot of people all over the world towards a shared common vision and raise funds for things that otherwise would be impossible to raise funds for. And this is the inspiration behind ValleyDAO. Is like, okay, you had a lot of people donate $47 million for the US Constitution. At the same time, you have people buying NFTs for 20, 30, 40, $50 million. What if some of this capital could go towards funding synthetic biology research and drive a real world impact? So this is really the foundation that ValleyDAO is built on. What we're trying to do is, on similar principles as the Constitution, get people from all over the world, give them a chance to directly contribute to a pool of capital, and then have a say in how those funds are used, with the ultimate goal of funding research in synthetic biology, and also partner up with the funded researchers and help them really bridge their technologies into the real world.
Wow, that was such a great story about the Constitution. And it was wonderful that they raised the money and they were so close to getting it. And I bet those people are still actively looking at this mechanism.
Yeah, what was the mechanism post losing the auction?
So this was facilitated by a smart contract. I'm not going to go into the definition of what it is, but what I can say here is that it's a wallet. You can program it. So everybody put their money into this wallet. And there were certain conditions of this wallet, was that if the auction would be lost, everybody would be able to claim their money back. And then you could decide if you want to claim your money back or if you wanted to keep it there and see what the ConstitutionDAO would do next. So people had the option to get their money back.
But then typically in a DAO like this, there is like a governance structure where the community would be able to say, okay, well, we didn't win this. What auction or what should we go after next? And then community votes on it, makes a decision. And if you decide to pull your money out, you have the option of doing that. But if you want to continue, you also have the option of deciding
where you want to put your money, right?
Exactly. In the case of ConstitutionDAO, the primary goal was the Constitution. It wasn't collecting more art or more historical artifacts. So the ConstitutionDAO ended up just fading out. They say like the best thing you gain in crypto, it's about the journey and the friends you make on the way. So I think a lot of friendship, a lot of connection was created from that. And I think like a lot of that spirit, a lot of that energy, a lot of that passion and realization that, okay, this is a powerful technology. Let's put it into some meaningful purpose. I really believe a lot of people walked away with that realization.
Hi, a quick shout out to our sponsor, Messaging Lab, the force multiplier for biotech. Your biotech company is making the world a better place. You know that, we know that. But does the world? There's a big reason why some biotech companies attract investors, sign up customers, and get attention. That reason is strategic communications. At Messaging Lab, we translate complex science and economics into compelling narratives. And we have done that for the most successful biotech companies across healthcare, agriculture, personal care and beauty, materials, and the list goes on. We're here to make sure your ideas not only get heard, but resonate with your audience. So if it's time to amplify your company's voice, visit messaginglab.com to explore how we can elevate your story and grow your business.
So let's focus on ValleyDAO. It was a wonderful story to inspire you and the creation of ValleyDAO to really fund SynBio project.
Yes, particularly in climate and food. So we don't focus on any therapeutics. So it's all climate and food related.
That's amazing that ValleyDAO employs this decentralized and democratic approach. Can you tell us how that works in real life? Give us an example, walk us through how this democratic approach has played out.
That's a great question. So let me get into a little bit on the definition of what a DAO is. In its most simplest form, and the way that I like to define it, it's a group of people with a shared vision towards a shared goal, and they have a shared bank account. During the inception of this organization, people can contribute funds, and in return, they receive a digital receipt, or also called tokens. And these tokens give every individual a governance right on how that treasury is used. So the majority of DAOs are structured like this. There are some DAOs that are structured quite differently, but conventionally speaking, this is what you will see 99% of the time. So back in around mid 2022, we had our token auction. So people could contribute funds. And during that time, back when I was starting it, I found a bunch of Discord servers. Discord is like the home of Web3 and blockchain and everything. And I found my way to decentralized science, which is kind of like an offspring of the open science movement, but more looking at how to use the blockchain for the funding and the dissemination of science, to make science more open, more transparent, more fair, new incentives and ways for researchers to get their research funded, but also new ways for being recognized. Like right now, you're not really recognized for doing a peer review. You don't get anything out of it other than you have to do it. But what if there was a system that gave people something in return for providing that really valuable knowledge? So I found my way to decentralized science, and there was these different Discord groups, and I just put together a message and like, hey, who wants to do this thing? Who is into synthetic biology? I'm super excited about this. Here's my thoughts. I started spamming it in different Discord channels, and then we were on a call. I think it was a call of like 10, 15 different people. I didn't know anybody on that call. And then we started discussing like, oh yeah, this is how it could be structured. This is how we could structure the foundational documents. And oh, let's create a website. So it was quite a playful process of how this thing was created. I was working full-time at a different job back then. So I didn't know that it was actually going to form and crystallize into what it is today. So started building that initial community. More people started like being drawn towards it. A lot of people were curious and like, what is this thing? People have never heard about blockchain before. But eventually we formed a core group. We formed our community that works in different, we call them growth groups. So different focus areas of the DAO.
How do you guys find those climate and food related projects, and how do people participate in it?
the pulse of ValleyDAO is called the Deal Flow and Incubation Growth Group. This group is responsible for the sourcing, reviewing of academic research projects that fall within our funding thesis. And then this group of people, they review it, and then they make a recommendation to the DAO. They write a governance proposal. So kind of like actual government, you write some nice papers, then you put it in front of the voters. You outline all of the details, who the researcher is, how much they're looking to raise, what are the different milestones, what are the IP terms, what is ValleyDAO getting in return for funding this piece of work. And the first project that we had identified that we were really convinced on, this was like before we had a token. The intention was to launch the token, raise capital to ultimately fund this first project. And this was a project at Imperial College London with Rodrigo Ledesma Amaro. And he is a connoisseur, for lack of a better term, when it comes to oleaginous yeast. Like this is a type of yeast that can produce a lot of fatty acids. And he's worked with this for like nearly a decade. And he's understood some of the biggest bottlenecks in getting this yeast to scale up. So we were really convinced by his proposal. And then we said, okay, let's do this. We have this project. We negotiated the deal terms. ValleyDAO was going to get licensing rights to the resulting IP. Great. Now we just need the money. And one day, somebody came into the Discord from a different decentralized science organization called Molecule. And they're like, hey, we really like what you're doing. We want to fund you. Here's 100K. I was like, okay, this just happened. And this capital was really what enabled a lot of the core group to actually go full time and started doing this more seriously. But long story short, we had a token auction. So people could contribute funds. There was no like pre-allocation like you see with many crypto projects where there's a big allocation to private investors or big allocations to like the team and advisors and so on. But rather we just said, okay, well, let's take the whole pie, cut like 5% from that, and then we auctioned out those tokens. And then we actually had that initial community that was created vote on what the allocations of the core team would be, of the advisors and so on. So it was kind of like a reverse because we've always wanted it to be community driven and like always be in alignment with the community so that we don't end up like 99% of the other crypto projects where there is no real alignment between the community, the token holders, and so on. But that token auction, we raised the necessary funding to fund this first project, which landed on around nearly $300,000, enough to hire a postdoc for 2 years and work on it full time.
I mean, I'm curious. So you hired a postdoc for 2 years. Is this the connoisseur of yeast? What's the research?
Yeah, the connoisseur of yeast is the PI of this project. And the postdoc is the one that is actually going to conduct the research.
Can you elaborate exactly what the research is? What's the core of the research? What's the thesis? What's the hypothesis here?
So this builds on previous research. So we fund things, if you're familiar with the technology readiness level scale, it's like from 1 to 9, where 9 is it's ready to fly, it's well established, and 1, it's just still discovery, it's just an idea, there's nothing on paper. We focus on TRL level 3 and 4, where there has been a demonstration of a proof of concept, and there is some initial data that can back up that with additional funding, with some additional work, we can actually bridge this to TRL 5 or 6, where somebody like a VC would actually be interested in putting more capital towards it. And this goes back again to the translational gap that is very precious to us and we're really focusing on. So what the research project is about, it's a way to make this yeast produce a much higher quantity than it can naturally produce. But we're talking like a significant amount, like so much so that it also ends up secreting a lot of its fatty acids. So it's focused on that, but then there is also a particular bioprocessing element to this where we would couple the yeast with a continuous bioprocess. So there would be continuous secretion that could continuously be harvested as well. So you would have the fatty acids be secreted and then they would be harvested. And you could couple this, as I mentioned before, a continuous bioprocess. So you could increase the overall efficiency of the process. And today, like nobody is able to really scale this up. Like I think some companies are catching on and have their first product, but they're still struggling, particularly with downstream. So if you can secrete these fatty acids, purification becomes less of a hassle. Like downstream processing, we learned that it takes up 70% of the actual production costs. So that is what we're trying to solve with this particular project. And then what the exact product will be, that maybe for the next podcast in 6 to 12 months, I can talk more about that. But yeah, it's super exciting. It's been great working with Rodrigo as well.
So, walk us through if this is successful. The DAO received $100,000 from Molecule, then raised another, correct me if I'm wrong, 200,000 more from a community. You had $300,000 to fund a researcher for 2 years. The goal is to go from TRL readiness level, say 3 to 5 or 6. What happens at the end of that cycle? Does money have to come in? Are you able to get investment in that comes back to the community? How do you see that playing out?
Once the research project is finished, usually we predict, like for this particular project, that we're going to be generating IP halfway through. So our plan is to, as soon as there is IP generated, to license it from the university. We've spoken with Rodrigo about this. And to him, he doesn't really have time to commercialize something. Like, he's a professor. He runs a lab of around 40 people. And that is what makes this match really good between ValleyDAO and him, because we can offload that whole responsibility and be fully responsible for commercializing his work. So we would license the IP from the university, and then we would incubate it through the community, actually. So this is where the community is key. So we've onboarded some really talented contributors to the Deal Flow group, all incentivized primarily because of the mission, right? But on top of this, there's also the tokenized incentives. So people can receive tokens for their contributions. And that really gives the chance to attract some really good talent as well. But yeah, this community acts like an extension of the researcher. So we would incubate the IP within the DAO. So we would identify the commercial path. We would identify a relevant team. We would find and recruit potential co-founders. And then we would go out and start raising venture capital funding for this. And during this whole time, ValleyDAO has a license to the IP, potentially also ownership of the IP. That is still something we're going to negotiate with Imperial in this case. But the DAO collectively governs that intellectual properties through a so-called IP NFT. But ultimately, this intellectual property is governed by the token holders. So they actually have a say in, first of all, if we're going to commercialize this, or if we're going to make it completely open source, or if we are going to sublicense it to somebody in industry. What I predict and what the community is most interested in doing is to spin it out into a startup using the method that I laid out previously with the commercial pathway, raising funds, finding the right team, and so on. The way that ValleyDAO sustains itself is really by either capturing value through royalties of the IP. So on any future sales of the product that is dependent on this piece of intellectual property, like ValleyDAO would receive some value back to the treasury so it can fund more science, or that we convert our license into equity in the company. And given that we're structured as a nonprofit, we're actually quite cheap in contrast to a lot of like VCs or accelerators or incubators, because we don't have that same pressure of instantly like making the money back, if that makes sense.
So say, for example, I wanted to participate in ValleyDAO. I buy the token. I'm a part of the community. The IP is created, and we collectively make a decision that the IP NFT is like being sold to maybe, let's say, we talk about fatty acids, like companies are making soap or something along those lines. But like I wanted to cash out. Like let's say at a certain point, I'm like, all right, this is valuable. Can I just cash out? And like, how do you prevent the community from cashing out all at once and having like a run on ValleyDAO? I mean, is there anything you guys are doing to continue to engage the community, keep them excited, maybe empowering them to even put more money in? I'm just kind of curious how you manage the community and how their actions affect the DAO.
So just one thing, one detail is that you don't have to own any tokens to be part of the community. So you can come in without any tokens, just a willingness to contribute, help out, get involved, right? You can earn tokens. You don't have to necessarily put capital in. So to your question, like if people wanted to cash out from their tokens, well, they could just go and sell them on the market, right? There is enough liquidity to manage that. And we keep on adding actually more liquidity through our own treasury so that there is more like ability to trade higher amounts of volume. And the thing is, if everybody decides to cash out, yeah, it's the same as like with any stock, right? Like any stock can crash at any point. Like these things are super risky, right? The core group and the core community, like everybody has that shared responsibility to continue creating value that takes us towards the mission of ValleyDAO, and that is to get more research funded and driven towards the market where it can have a real impact on the planet and people's lives. So yeah, it's a full possibility. These things are super risky. They're very experimental, but that's also what makes them quite interesting. Like you got to experiment a little bit to see if something works or not. But yeah, if you're interested in getting involved, I'd be super happy to get you involved. The thing is, like, we've had so many contributors, for example, they find the Discord and they're like, oh, the structure of your Discord, like how the channels are managed, it's like, it's crap. Here's a recommendation how you can make it better. That's like a very simple type of contribution. But then there is also people who join like the deal flow group and contribute with some sort of knowledge. And that is like, you should not focus on this type of research, because based on my experience, I've worked with this for the last 5 years. There is nothing here. And that insight, I don't think you can have it in a traditional company where you don't have like this open structure, right? And I think this is really what is the unique value proposition, or like the strength of a DAO, is it's open. Anybody can come in and start contributing value. So Carl, for example, maybe he looks at the website and like, oh, your messaging is crap. This is how you can improve it. Amazing, Carl. We implement that. We send Carl some tokens if he wants, or you can do it symbolically. Like a lot of people do it symbolically. Some people never ask even for tokens. They just want to be involved, right? So it's a very dynamic environment in terms of what people want, why they do it, how they do it, and so on.
Yeah, but just to be clear, the ValleyDAO website is beautiful, and I recommend that anybody who's listening take a look at it. And it also really defines what the contribution mechanisms are that Albert's talking about. And it's definitely worth getting to know, not just ValleyDAO, but really this bigger idea of DAOs and how they can make an impact on scientific research. Tell us what other projects you guys are funding. I find it to be super interesting, that you start out with this yeast project, but what are the other ones that people should know about?
So these projects, they're still in progress. They're still being reviewed and vetted by the community. Hopefully in the next month, we'll be able to make a couple of announcements on what the projects are going to be about. One of the projects is going to be with a researcher that you probably know who he is. He has a big beard. I'm not going to say more than that, but the research is super interesting. Like there's applications on Earth, in space, on Mars, and it's within a segment where there are a lot of incumbents, but they're not using this particular type of, let's call it, feedstock. And like the community has gone insane. We're not discussing this in public. Like we still have like certain barriers due to the confidentiality of certain projects. So before we actually onboard somebody, let's say to the deal flow group, they sign an NDA, we get to know them, we work a little bit with them to see if they're like legit and if they're serious, and then we actually onboard them to that final group. But the deal flow group is super excited about this. Everybody is sharing scientific articles, everybody's crunching numbers and trying to kind of like, can we actually do this? And we're getting to some really interesting conclusions. And since day one, one of the core goals have been to maximize the impact of every dollar, because we do have a limited amount of funds. We want to ensure that we put it to the project that is going to drive the biggest impact, but also in a realistic sense, right? Because I see there's a lot of fascinating research out there, but the problem is people get super excited about it, right? Like let's say computation in cells, or these very complicated circuitries that can allow you to calculate things in a cell, or like storing things in DNA and to make that more efficient than big data servers. The problem with that is, at least with the computational stuff, is that there is really no clear pathway for that to make money today. It will be in the future, but that is the Kool-Aid that we have to drink, or like the reality juice that we have to ingest.
Au contraire, mon frère. Actually just interviewed a gentleman by the name of Kyle Tomek, who has a DNA data storage company, and they've used chemically modified DNA and had their first sale. So a little bit of that Kool-Aid is becoming a little bit more drinkable, I guess. I don't know if that's the analogy.
You should join the deal flow group. We need more of that inside.
Here's what I would add to that, because the thesis for ValleyDAO is to focus on a certain level of technology readiness to bring it up to a point where we could start to think about commercializing it. There is a lot of early stuff that just isn't going to make sense. So I think it's an interesting way to vet potential projects.
So we have this postdoc that's working on this project. In terms of like spending on supplies, any capital expenditure, is that all this person's decision? Does the community get involved in any decision making on like the capital expenditure side, or does that postdoc have full free reign on what decisions to make on maybe buying them from a certain vendor versus another one? I'm just curious how that works.
Yeah, we don't micromanage to that extent. We meet with the postdoc every 2 weeks.
Okay.
We ask them, hey, how did it go? Oh, it went great. Nice. Oh, it went bad. Okay, what can we do differently? It's really that we fully know that like the best person to make decisions on the ground in the lab is going to be them. So we don't want to get in their way at that stage. The only time where we are focusing on the details and get into the weeds is like right before the research is going to ensue, to make sure we have alignment with the researcher, that they're aware of the milestones. Many times we help them define those milestones based on commercial benchmarks. It's like, okay, this is what you can expect the yield should be at the end of the project or at the middle of the project. If we're getting closer to that yield, we're heading into the right direction. So it's kind of like this springboard type of relationship that we have with the researcher.
Yeah. So, okay, you mentioned that there will be intellectual property. Does that intellectual property end up being owned by the DAO? What does that look like from a legal point of view?
Yeah, we're going to be filing IP for the research that we fund. And this IP is going to legally be owned by our legal entity. So we have a real world incorporated entity that allows us to open a bank account, for example, that allows us to have people on a payroll, that allows us to pay taxes, right? So all of that is factored into, like, we're trying to make this as legit as possible and work with the constitutions or the legal frameworks that are friendly to DAOs. And Switzerland happens to have really good frameworks for DAOs. So that's where we're registered, and that's the entity that will hold the IP. Now, the people that are registered on the legal entity, they act in good faith. Like, there's a trust relationship here as well between those individuals, which happens to be me and the rest of the core team, and the community. So there's really no way to make that permissionless so far by having the community fully control it, like on chain. There are some groups of people who are trying to create technology so that community members don't even have to trust the core members. They can just verify it on their own and ensure that, okay, the IP is there. These are like the terms and everything.
Wow. Ultimately, sounds like you guys are a venture fund. The way that you're describing deal flow, looking for unique projects to commercialize and have this IP, it sounds like another avenue for entrepreneurs or academic founders, which I love that term. It sounds like another avenue for them to get funding. We've
had venture funds put money into ValleyDAO as well. The community consists not only of the everyday person, but also like larger organizations. Recently, we actually had 2 people from a family office join the deal flow group. Of course, they had to pay a little bit of money to be part of that because there's a lot of deal flow in there, a lot of insights, a lot of talent, and so on. But we're actually partnering up with them to co-fund some projects. So in the end, we want to fund as much research as possible. So partnering up with these different organizations that are going to increase our runway and the amount of projects that we fund is, I think, going to be key, because research takes a lot of time and you have a limited amount of funds. So we're continuously thinking about new ways of bringing capital into this ecosystem. I don't like the term venture fund, though, like defining it, the ValleyDAO as that, because I believe it's so much more its own thing. But I also understand that people might see it in that way. But yeah, I think it's so much more than just a venture fund.
I think a lot of it is just because the whole DAO structure is still very new. You talked about being able to incorporate the DAO in Switzerland. I know, like I was going to say, did you guys incorporate it in Wyoming? I know Wyoming is supposed to be very favorable for DAOs. I know Panama is also, the Cayman Islands. All these places make it possible for people to set up this decentralized autonomous organization there so that you can access the banking system. But I think that it's so new. And I think, Iram, you're right. It seems like analogous to a venture fund, but it's much more community based than a venture fund would ever be. And the community ends up benefiting instead of just this select group of LPs that have put the money into this entity.
Yeah, I mean, I'm not saying this to bait you into the community, but the best way to learn how things work, what you can do is to just get involved, really.
Be a part of the community. Yes.
Be part of the community. Let's go.
Yeah, that's for our listeners too. I mean, if you want to have a call to action here for our listeners, I mean, this is very fascinating. It sounds like a really cool mechanism to fund the future of biotechnology. But what do you see as the future of ValleyDAO? What type of projects are you hoping you'll find in your deal flow? So tell us a little bit more about the next 5 to 10 years for ValleyDAO.
A couple of aspects. The first one, seeing science fund more science. So activating that flywheel of science turning into value, turning into funding more science. That's key goal number one. What we do with that fund, okay, we'll fund more science, but what if one of these scientific projects turn into $1 billion company? Well, then you have a lot of disposable incomes. So I've been thinking more and more, what if ValleyDAO could start funding the establishment of physical infrastructure like labs and establish that in different places all over the world and create a research ecosystem that is independent from academia, that doesn't have the same pressures, the same downsides and the bureaucracy of academia. And maybe community members could have access directly to those labs and go there, start learning biology, but also start developing things that could drive an impact on a global scale. That's how I've been thinking about it more and more on the long-term vision and future and where this could go. Another future that I like to envision is like the bioeconomy as it is, like nature ultimately gave us all of these tools, like, hey, take them, use them. And we've managed to use them in a way that really improves the lives of so many people. But who owns the bioeconomy? Is it a couple of organizations, a couple of big companies who benefit from the value and the impact that this creates? Or can we create a bioeconomy that is co-owned, co-shared, really owned by nobody, but governed by everybody? That's my big dream.
Yeah, I mean, I don't know if it's a DAO-funded focused research organization or if it's a focused research organization DAO. Albert, thank you so much for taking the time. This is so good. Every time I talk to you, I feel like my mind is blown and I learn so much more. But I think I need to get into helping out at ValleyDAO so I can have my learnings expanded.
Yeah, absolutely. Absolutely. I'd love to have you on my live show on LinkedIn. I would love to chat more about communications, design, marketing, all of these things. I find that super fascinating. I love design. I love form. I love marketing. So I think that would be a really, really interesting conversation.
Spirit of collaboration is happening right here live on Grab Everything.
Yeah. We look forward to talking to you soon.
All right, Iram, what do you think of that interview?
I loved it. I'm ready. I'm ready to join ValleyDAO. I want to support Albert. I hope listeners are hyped and at least look into ValleyDAO and see how they can get involved. So there's a Discord channel that you can join. We'll add it to the show notes and see how you can support if you're interested. Maybe you'll want to create a DAO of your own for a specific cause. So this is a great learning experience to learn by doing. So I'm very excited to learn more.
Yeah, to me, it's super interesting. I've been following this decentralized, autonomous organization structure for a while. I think I know enough to get in trouble. I'm able to talk a little bit about the legislation in different places like Switzerland or Wyoming or even Panama, because they've got laws that are being put into place to make these things favorable. But I love the idea that these things are based on smart contracts. You raise a certain amount of money, the money is distributed to a researcher or distributed to the founders of the DAO. So I find what these guys are doing, what Molecule is doing, what LabDAO is doing, what HairDAO is doing to be super interesting. And I think that there's a lot of potential for this model for funding research and moving things forward. As I mentioned in the intro, we already had Jocelyn Pearl. And if you're interested in learning more about LabDAO, you can listen to that episode or you can read on the Messaging Lab blog the interview we did with Ari Lipman of Mars Bio, who also has like a company that I think is going to come out of stealth pretty soon.
And we'll have Laura Minkini of AthenaDAO, which looks at women's health. So that'll be exciting to see what research they're doing to support whether it's women looking to get pregnant or regulating the periods or anything else that's related to women's health. Women or men biologically are different, of course, and there's a lot of research that needs to happen to create treatments and help for women. So I'm very excited to speak with Laura in the coming weeks.
I think it's worth mentioning we're about to reach our 75th episode. Given that we've got a lot of episodes out there, we decided to start curating them and really taking a look at what we've created over the past year and a half. This is something that I think we'll do on a regular basis. But what's interesting is that in looking at the episodes, we found that we've done more on biomaterials than anything else. And I think that's a result of us attending Biofabricate. We both attended in 2022. I attended this year. We've done 11 episodes on climate solutions, the same number of episodes around the possibilities of synthetic biology, and then also 8 on investors in the space. So what we're going to do is we'll probably blog about this on the Messaging Lab blog. We'll also put it out on LinkedIn so people can see. And I think what's going to happen is people are going to start to look at Grow Everything and ask, where do I get started? There's so many different avenues. And I think for us, it's going to be a matter of saying, well, what are you interested in? Are you interested in investors? Well, here's the 8 episodes that talk about investing in synthetic biology or growing everything.
Yeah, that's awesome. Yeah, I was talking to our producers about this yesterday, and they're like, you can just make Spotify playlists and you can add episodes from other podcasts as well that talk about similar content. And then you can just share the playlist.
Oh, that's a great idea. I hadn't even thought about that. I love that because I look for playlists all the time, but medieval hip hop has never appeared on my playlist.
It will now. I mean,
now it's going to, yeah.
Get on the train. It's such a vibe.
All right. Well, that's the pod, unless there's anything else.
My inner John Cumbers wants to say, come to SynBioBeta. It's a great, great conference. You'll meet people from across the biotech spectrum. And because we're all buddy-buddy, John Cumbers and SynBioBeta has offered our audience, our listeners, $300 off of registration for SynBioBeta. Just use the code Grow Everything.
All right. We hope to see you there. That's the pod. We'll see you later.
Bye-bye.